9-year-old Charlise Mutten as the search for the little girl stretches into its third night. The homicide squad is now among those trying to work out where she is.
A child was reported missing from a home where everyone insisted she should have been safe. When officers arrived, they were told that 9-year-old Charlise Mutten had not been seen for several hours, and no one could say exactly when she was last accounted for. The adults on scene offered what information they could, but the details were limited, and the uncertainty around her movements created an immediate concern. Search teams began moving through the property while detectives worked to confirm the basic facts, like who last spoke to Charlise, where had she been earlier in the day, and whether anyone had noticed something unusual before the call for help was made. According to early notes, there were no obvious signs of a struggle, no clear direction of travel, and no nearby witnesses who could describe anything relevant. It was a situation where every possibility had to be considered. As the search widened, the absence of reliable information made it difficult to determine where Charlise might have gone or what caused her sudden disappearance. Nothing found in those first hours offered a definitive lead, and that left investigators confronting the only question they could ask at the start. How does a 9-year-old vanish without a single person seeing where she went?
You are watching Crime Insider. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and drop a like on the video.
When detectives arrived at the property, their first task was simple: establish the exact sequence of events leading up to the missing person call. Officers separated the adults on scene and asked each person to describe their movements from the previous night into the morning. On paper, it should have been a straightforward reconstruction. But as the first interviews were taken, investigators noticed that the versions of events did not align as neatly as expected. According to the early notes, the adults listed different times for when they believed 9-year-old Charlise Mutten was last seen inside the house. Some described routine moments from the previous evening, while others referenced early morning checks that could not be confirmed. Detectives did not yet treat this as suspicious, but the lack of agreement meant the starting point of the timeline required closer attention. Establishing the final confirmed sighting became the priority. Officers then requested access to the devices and messages of those present. Investigators asked for call logs, text timestamps, and any communication that could anchor specific moments. These checks were standard procedure, but they offered the chance to place the adults more reliably within the property during the period Charlise was believed to be inside. Detectives later noted that some answers were tentative, with several adults needing to think back or recheck before providing a time. The layout of the property created additional complications. The house sat on raised ground surrounded by outbuildings, parked vehicles, narrow paths, and dense bush at the edges. Officers recorded the positions of the rooms, entry points, and line-of-sight obstacles to understand who could have seen Charlise and when. The structure made it difficult to confirm movements without cross-checking each person's account against physical layout. Even simple details like which lights were on or who walked through common areas were not consistent across statements. By midday, detectives had mapped out a provisional sequence: the adults' rough recollections, their stated movements, and the estimated time frame in which Charlise was believed to have been inside the home. What stood out was not a dramatic contradiction, but the absence of a clear, unified account. Every interview contained small differences, nothing conclusive, but enough to prevent investigators from establishing a reliable last confirmed sighting. Officers expanded the questioning to include routine matters: medication use, household tasks, planned outings, and overnight visitors. Detectives later wrote that the responses created more variation rather than clarity. Some adults recalled sleeping at different times. Others hesitated when asked who had been awake during certain hours. No one provided a definitive moment when Charlise was last seen moving through the house. As daylight continued, investigators reviewed the notes again, looking for a reference point that could anchor the timeline. But the details remained fragmented, and that left detectives facing the first unresolved problem of the case. Without a verifiable last sighting, where did the investigation truly begin? When detectives began sorting through the early statements, they had to understand who Charlise had been living with and why she was spending the holidays in New South Wales instead of Queensland. According to court records and family accounts, Charlise had been raised primarily by her grandmother in Coolangatta, where her routine was stable. School staff described her attendance as consistent, and child protection records showed no ongoing concerns in that household. That continuity created a clear baseline. Investigators then turned to Charlise Mutten, Charlise's mother. Public registry documents confirmed that Charlise had a criminal history linked to a 2017 driving incident in which a passenger died. She had served a custodial sentence and was on parole at the time Charlise traveled south. According to court filings, she had remained in contact with parole officers during that period. But the decision to bring Charlise to New South Wales was made privately, without formal oversight. During that earlier custodial period, Charlise met Justin Lawrence Stein, who was also serving time for unrelated drug offenses. Their relationship continued after release, and by late 2021, the pair were engaged. The connection positioned Stein as a central figure in Charlise's holiday plans, even though his own criminal history was documented and recent. Detectives flagged that detail because it framed the household dynamic that Charlise entered in December. The setting itself added another element. Stein's family owned the Wildenstein property at Mount Wilson, a large bushland estate used for functions and events. According to land registry information and statements from former workers, parts of the property were isolated, with limited traffic and minimal surveillance. Investigators noted that Charlise had only been at this location for a short period before the disappearance report was made. Another factor involved the living arrangement across two sites. Detectives confirmed that Charlise spent time at both Mount Wilson and a caravan in Lower Portland, where Charlise stayed on certain nights. This movement across locations meant there was no single consistent caretaker during the holiday visit. When investigators reviewed phone logs, they found patterns showing Charlise and Stein were frequently separated, leaving Charlise under alternating supervision. That separation later became relevant when establishing who had physical care of her on specific days. By the time detectives reconstructed the family's recent history, one theme kept reappearing. Charlise had traveled from a stable home in Queensland into a setting marked by legal troubles, shifting relationships, and inconsistent supervision. And as investigators mapped out those dynamics, they were left with a pressing concern. How did a 9-year-old vanish inside a household already struggling to hold itself together? By the time detectives narrowed the timeline, two dates stood out with unusual consistency: 11 and 12 January 2022. According to phone logs, messages, and location data, these were the days when Charlise was last verifiably alive, and the only days when Justin Stein had uninterrupted care of her. Investigators isolated this window because Charlise Mutten was confirmed to be staying at the Lower Portland caravan site, away from the Mount Wilson property. Records from the caravan park supported that detail. Staff confirmed Charlise's presence during those nights, and her phone data matched the location. According to investigators, her device did not return to Mount Wilson until later. That meant the only adult with Charlise at the property during this period was Stein, a fact that became central to the Crown case once the timeline was established. Phone activity on Stein's device showed limited movement during those 2 days. Data placed him repeatedly near the main house and surrounding structures on the Wildenstein estate. Investigators later pointed out that the lack of broader travel was consistent with someone staying on the property for extended periods. That stationary pattern became a key reference point against his later claims that Charlise had been active around the grounds on her own. Witness information added another layer. Neighbors who lived near the access road reported seeing Stein on the property during daylight hours, but none reported seeing Charlise. According to police summaries, the absence of any sightings of a child outdoors in an area where visitors normally noticed movement raised questions about her condition during those days. No witness recalled hearing her voice or seeing her near the driveway or house. Digital traces from Charlise's belongings were also reviewed. Investigators found no outgoing messages, no calls, and no search activity from her device after early January. That silence contrasted sharply with her normal usage patterns, documented from her grandmother's home in Queensland. Detectives highlighted this gap during the investigation, noting that it removed any indication that she was active or mobile during the 11 to 12 January period. The Crown later argued that this 2-day window marked the final point at which Charlise's whereabouts could be confidently tracked. Every subsequent movement linked to the household involved only adults, and every data point pointed to Stein as the last person with undisputed access to her. And as investigators studied those silent hours inside an isolated house, one unanswered question stayed in front of them. What happened in that narrow window when the only person with Charlise was the man who later denied all responsibility? In the early hours of 14th of January 2022, neighbors near the Mount Wilson property reported seeing Justin Stein's red Holden Colorado leaving the area. According to their statements, the vehicle was towing a boat and traveling without headlights. That detail was logged because the timing placed Stein on the road before any missing person call was made. At that moment, investigators did not yet know the significance of this departure. As morning progressed, Stein continued driving across several parts of Sydney. CCTV later confirmed the Colorado moving through Marsden Park, where Stein entered a hardware store. Transaction records showed a purchase of 5 20-kilogram bags of sand, each carried out by Stein alone. Staff who reviewed the footage described him as focused and moving quickly, with no child present and no conversation with anyone around him. The next recorded sighting placed Stein at a different location, with the boat still attached. Cameras captured a large plastic barrel positioned in the tray of the ute. At this stage of the investigation, the contents of the barrel were unknown, but the image became a key reference point because it tracked the container's movements through the day. The barrel remained visible in each subsequent appearance on nearby service station and street-side cameras. Throughout the afternoon, Stein visited multiple boat ramps along the Hawkesbury and surrounding waterways. Witnesses later recalled his attempts to reverse the boat toward the water, but none saw him complete a launch. Several described him adjusting ropes, repositioning the trailer, and returning repeatedly to the ute. The pattern suggested repeated hesitation or difficulty, but at the time no one realized the importance of what he was carrying. Later that day, Stein was seen driving through Drummoyne, Windsor, and areas near the Colo region. The same barrel remained in the tray during each sighting. In one location, he parked for an extended period before driving off again. According to staff at a nearby service station, Stein appeared anxious to leave quickly, staying only long enough to fuel the vehicle before towing the boat back onto the main road. As daylight faded, Stein made additional stops before returning towards Sydney. By then, he had traveled considerable distances with the same barrel, the same boat, and no explanation that matched the hours he spent moving between locations. And once those movements were finally mapped in sequence, one detail stood out above everything else. Stein spent the entire day traveling alone with a barrel. No one was allowed to look inside. Once detectives collected the separate sightings of Stein's ute from the previous days, they began assembling them into a single timeline. According to the investigation records, officers cross-checked the timestamps from stores, service stations, and roadside cameras. That comparison created a narrow sequence of movements pointing toward the Colo River region, an area that had not been part of the initial missing person search. With that pattern established, technical teams examined the digital records from Stein's phone. Analysts noted several consistent location pings along remote roads near the river, each aligning with the same general path suggested by the CCTV list. Investigators later said the overlap was strong enough to justify a targeted ground search. Until that moment, the search had remained centered around Mount Wilson. On 18 January 2022, officers were deployed to the coordinates highlighted by the data. Search teams moved down steep embankments and into narrow pockets of scrub where a vehicle could briefly pull over without being noticed. According to the field notes from that day, one officer identified tire impressions on a patch of flattened soil beside a sharp drop. That detail prompted the team to scan the slope beneath it. Not far down the embankment, officers located a large plastic barrel resting among fallen branches. Its size and appearance matched the container seen in earlier CCTV captures. Detectives secured the scene, photographed the area, and called for a forensic unit. Because of the angle and weight, recovery staff used ropes and controlled lifts to bring the barrel up to the roadside without disturbing the contents. At a controlled location nearby, the barrel was opened under forensic supervision. Inside, officers found the body of 9-year-old Charlise Mutten, positioned with sand from the bags purchased days earlier. Forensic examiners documented gunshot injuries and evidence of concealment, concluding that the container had been prepared before the barrel was moved to the river's edge. Each detail supported the view that this site was used only for disposal, not for any part of the crime itself. After the barrel was removed, investigators searched the surrounding ground for secondary items. No weapons, cartridges, or clothing were recovered from the slope or the adjacent roadside. According to detectives, the absence of additional evidence reinforced the belief that the killing had occurred elsewhere. The Colo River site was the final stage in a sequence investigators had been piecing together since the disappearance report was filed. And on that riverbank, with the barrel finally opened, the search for a missing child became something else entirely, a confirmation that someone had gone to great lengths to hide what happened to Charlise. When the trial began in the New South Wales Supreme Court, prosecutors focused on the narrow sequence already established during the investigation. Their opening outlined how Charlise had been located inside the barrel recovered near the Colo River, and how every confirmed timestamp from previous days formed a consistent line toward that discovery. According to the Crown, the physical and digital evidence surrounding the final location left little room for uncertainty about the chain of events. Forensic specialists then presented their findings. They reinforced the autopsy conclusions already documented by investigators, stating that Charlise's injuries and the substances found in her system were not consistent with any accidental scenario. Their testimony centered on the medical indicators and the lack of evidence suggesting an unintended outcome. According to the specialists, the pattern of injuries and impairment supported a deliberate act. The court next heard from digital technology analysts. Unlike the reconstruction process used during the investigation, their presentation focused on what the compiled data showed, not how it had been assembled. They explained that the GPS information, phone tower contacts, and relevant CCTV frames placed Stein and the barrel on a direct path leading to the eventual disposal site. Prosecutors argued that the alignment of those data points demonstrated purposeful movement rather than confusion or panic. When Stein took the stand, he provided a new account. He claimed that Charlise Mutten, Charlise's mother, had shot the child and instructed him to remove the body. Stein told the court he had acted out of fear and confusion, insisting he had no role in the shooting itself. His version shifted responsibility away from himself and suggested that earlier explanations he gave police were incomplete. Callista testified shortly afterward, and her position remained unchanged. She denied any involvement, and she rejected Stein's claims entirely. She pointed to the same accommodation records and phone location data the jury had already reviewed, stating those documents confirmed she had been in Lower Portland at the time of the alleged shooting. According to her account, Stein's allegation was an attempt to divert blame rather than an accurate description of events. In closing arguments, prosecutors told the jury that Stein's testimony conflicted with the verified timeline, the medical findings, and the digital data presented throughout the trial. They emphasized that the Crown's case relied on a complete evidentiary sequence rather than a single detail. Defense counsel argued that the absence of an eyewitness required the jury to consider whether any reasonable doubt remained, urging them not to accept the prosecution's interpretation without scrutiny. And as proceedings drew to a close, the courtroom settled into a stillness that followed every major trial. A moment where the evidence had been delivered, the arguments had finished, and the final judgment rested with the jury who had heard every aspect of the case. On 19th of June 2024, the jury returned to the courtroom after deliberating on the evidence presented across the trial. According to court officers, the foreperson delivered a single, clear verdict. Justin Stein was guilty of the murder of Charlise Mutten. The finding ended months of legal argument and confirmed the prosecution's position that Charlise's death had not been the result of confusion, accident, or misunderstanding. It marked the first time investigators could speak openly about elements of the case that had been restricted during the proceedings. The court moved into sentencing submissions soon after the verdict. Prosecutors outlined the seriousness of the offending, focusing on the steps taken after Charlise's death and the sustained effort to avoid detection. They described Stein's actions as calculated and persistent, noting that the manner of concealment and the length of time before discovery had significantly hindered the investigation. Defense counsel asked the court to consider Stein's background, mental health history, and personal circumstances, arguing those factors should mitigate the penalty. When sentencing was delivered on 26 August 2024, the judge imposed life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. According to the sentencing remarks, the seriousness of the crime met the threshold reserved for the most severe penalty available. The judge referred to Charlise's vulnerability, the deliberate handling of her body, and the absence of any attempt to seek help at any point after the shooting. The court concluded that the community's need for protection and accountability outweighed any prospects of rehabilitation. Outside the courthouse, the public response was immediate. Community groups released statements acknowledging the conclusion of the trial while expressing support for Charlise's family in Queensland. According to representatives, her grandmother had followed the proceedings quietly and had asked for privacy once the verdict was announced. Messages from former teachers, neighbors, and family friends appeared across social platforms in the days that followed, focusing on Charlise's life rather than the circumstances surrounding her death. Charlise Mutten did not face charges in relation to the crime. After testifying and denying Stein's accusations, she maintained a low profile once sentencing was complete. Court documents noted that investigators found no evidence linking her to Charlise's injuries, and no further legal action was pursued. Public discussion around her involvement continued, but it held no place in the formal findings of the court. In the weeks after the decision, officials acknowledged that the legal chapter had ended, but the broader questions surrounding Charlise's safety, movement, and supervision remain points of public reflection. The verdict closed the file, yet the consequences of what happened stretched far beyond the courtroom. And for everyone who followed the case from the first search to the final ruling, one truth sat heavier than any sentence delivered. Justice could account for responsibility, but it could not return the life that had been lost. As we close this case, we want to hear what you think. Do you believe the verdict delivered in court reflects justice in this situation? Or do you feel there are unanswered questions that still need to be examined? Share your thoughts in the comments and let us know where you're watching from. Your perspective adds depth to every case we cover. If you want more factual, carefully told true crime stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to Crime Insider